Stop scrolling. Right now. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about World War II. What if I told you that in 1944, deep in the heart of Texas, Nazi prisoners were given horses instead of chains? That German women who had been taught Americans were bloodthirsty monsters discovered something so shocking it would shatter their entire worldview? That a simple cowboy with dirt under his fingernails would do more to win the peace than all the generals and politicians combined? This isn't just another war story. This is the most incredible true story you've never heard, a story so unbelievable that even the people who lived it couldn't convince their own families it was real. You think you know how America treated its enemies? You're about to discover you were wrong about everything. This story will haunt you. It will restore your faith in humanity. And by the end, you'll understand why this single ranch in Texas may have changed the course of history itself. You won't believe what happened next. But every word of it is true. Texas, 1944. The convoy of military trucks kicked up clouds of red dust as they rolled through the scorching heat outside Amarillo. Inside one of those trucks, 24-year-old Lili Marleen pressed her face against the wooden slats, watching America blur past in a haze of endless prairie and barbed wire. Her Luftwaffe uniform was stained with weeks of travel, her eyes hollow from the terror that had consumed her since capture near Cherbourg. She was certain she was going to die. And not quickly. Every German knew what happened to prisoners in America. The Reich's propaganda machine had made absolutely sure of that. Posters plastered across factory walls showed emaciated prisoners behind barbed wire. Radio broadcasts described torture chambers hidden in the American desert. Medical experiments. Mass graves. Stories were whispered in barracks across Europe, each one more horrifying than the last. For women like Lili, captured auxiliaries from the Luftwaffe, the rumors were even darker. They spoke in hushed tones of labor camps where female prisoners disappeared forever. Of things too terrible to say aloud. Of fates worse than death. Lili had seen the fear in her fellow prisoners' eyes during the long journey across the Atlantic. Some had tried to throw themselves overboard rather than face what awaited them in America. Others had stopped eating, hoping to die before they reached their destination. The nightmares had started weeks ago. Every night, she dreamed of barbed wire and screaming. Every morning, she woke to the reality that she was one day closer to her own personal hell. The truck lurched to a stop. "This is it," whispered Anna, the radio operator sitting beside her. Her voice cracked like autumn leaves. "God help us all." The tailgate creaked open, flooding the darkness with blinding Texas sunlight. Lili braced herself for the shouting, for rifle butts and barking dogs, for the beginning of the nightmare she'd been promised. Instead, a calm voice drawled, "Ma'am, watch your step." A tall man in a cream-colored Stetson stood waiting, his sleeves rolled up, dust coating his worn leather boots. He wasn't wearing a military uniform. He looked like something out of a Western movie, a cowboy, complete with the slow, easy smile that belonged in Hollywood, not a prisoner of war camp. "Welcome to Texas, ladies," he said, tipping his hat with old-world courtesy. "Name's Frank Callahan. Y'all look like you could use some water." Lili stared in confusion as he handed her a tin cup filled with cold, clean water, cleaner than anything she'd tasted since France. She drank it all at once, waiting for the trick, for the trap, for the moment when the kindness would turn to cruelty. It never came. Behind Frank, the Texas skies stretched so wide it seemed impossible, blue from horizon to horizon without a single building to break the view. Cattle moved lazily in distant fields like brown and white dots on an endless canvas. A windmill turned slowly in the breeze, its blades catching the light. Somewhere, a dog barked, chasing shadows in the dust. "You folks will be helping out here on the ranch," Frank continued, gesturing toward a collection of wooden buildings and corrals that looked more like a movie set than a prison. Feeding cattle, mending fences, maybe even some riding if you're up for it. Riding? Liselott almost laughed out loud. She had expected shackles, not saddles. Chains, not reins. But this was just the beginning of the impossible. As the truck drove away, leaving them standing in the middle of nowhere with nothing but open prairie for miles, Liselott realized something that made her stomach drop. There were no fences, no guard towers, no machine gun nests, no barbed wire gleaming in the afternoon sun. They could run. But where would they go? And more importantly, why would they want to? That first night, sitting in a clean bunkhouse with actual beds and blankets, Liselott stared at the plate of food they'd been given. Beef stew that smelled like heaven, fresh bread still warm from the oven, butter that melted on her tongue, even a slice of apple pie that tasted like childhood memories she'd almost forgotten. She couldn't eat. She was certain it was poisoned or a test, or some elaborate form of psychological torture designed to break their spirits before the real suffering began. "They're trying to break us," whispered another woman, Maria. "Make us soft before they show us what they really are." But by morning, hunger defeated paranoia. They ate, and they realized something that shook them to their core. The enemy they'd been taught to despise was feeding them better than their own army ever had. But the real shock, the moment that would haunt Liselott for the rest of her life, came at sunrise. Frank appeared at the bunkhouse door with a group of weathered cowboys, each leading a saddled horse. The morning sun glinted off their spurs, and their easy laughter filled the air like music from another world. "Morning, ladies," Frank called out cheerfully, tipping his hat. "Hope y'all slept well. Time to get to work. Can't tend cattle from the ground, and we've got a herd to move today." Liselott stared at the horses, beautiful animals with gentle eyes and glossy coats that spoke of careful breeding and patient training. Real horses. Not the broken-down nags she might have expected for prisoners, but quarter horses bred for ranch work, worth more money than most Germans saw in a year. What happened next defied everything they knew about war, about prisoners, about America itself. It defied logic, reason, and every story they'd been told about their captors. Frank was serious. Dead serious. They were actually going to put enemy prisoners on horseback. They were going to arm them with lassos and trust them with livestock worth thousands of dollars. It was madness. Beautiful, impossible, American madness. Within minutes, German women who had been taught that Americans were savage degenerates were being patiently taught to ride horses by men who spoke softly and laughed easily. When Liselott's horse bolted, dragging her in circles around the corral while she screamed in terror and embarrassment, the cowboys didn't shout or curse. They helped her back into the saddle with gentle hands and encouraging words. "Don't fight her," one drawled in broken German. "Feel the rhythm. She'll carry you if you trust her." The word hit Liselott like a physical blow. When had anyone in this war spoken of trust? By noon, something miraculous had happened. Liselott was galloping across open prairie, herding cattle under the endless Texas sky, her hair flying loose from its pins, dust coating her face, laughing like a child who had never known war or fear or propaganda. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt truly, completely alive. The fear that had gripped her like a vice since capture began to melt under the relentless prairie sun, replaced by something she hadn't felt since before the war began, something she'd almost forgotten existed. Wonder. Pure, childlike wonder. She was free. Not legally, not officially, but in every way that mattered to the human heart. The horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, the sky was so big it made her dizzy, and she was trusted with a horse that could carry her anywhere she wanted to go. She could have ridden straight into that sunset and never looked back. The cowboys knew it. Frank knew it. Hell, they all knew it. But she didn't want to run. For the first time since the war began, she wanted to stay exactly where she was. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of red and gold, the cowboys invited the German women to join them around a campfire. Harmonicas and guitars appeared, filling the night with music that seemed to bridge every difference between enemies. When someone began humming Lili Marleen, the song every German soldier knew by heart, Lieselot found herself singing along before she realized it. Her voice cracked with emotion as the familiar melody wrapped around her like a warm embrace. English and German voices blended in harmony, and for a few magical minutes, there were no enemies under the Texas stars, only people sharing the same song, the same fire, the same small hope that maybe the world could be different than they'd been told. "War ends sooner," Frank said quietly, "when folks realize they were never that different." But the real transformation was just beginning. Here's what makes this story even more incredible. By 1944, America had become the world's largest keeper of prisoners, holding over 400,000 captured Axis soldiers and civilians on its own soil. Think about that number, nearly 500,000 enemy combatants living in the American heartland while the war still raged. Any other nation would have used them for slave labor, would have starved them, beaten them, worked them to death in mines and factories. It would have been easy. It would have been expected. Hell, it would have been justified after Pearl Harbor, after the Bataan Death March, after everything America had endured. But America didn't do that. Instead, the U.S. Army followed the Geneva Conventions with obsessive, almost religious precision. Prisoners were paid actual wages for their work, money they could save or spend at camp stores. They were allowed to write uncensored letters home. They attended religious services, learned English in camp schools, formed orchestras and theater groups. It was psychological warfare of the most subtle and devastating kind. America was proving that democracy wasn't just a political system, it was a way of being human. And it was working. To the German women working on Texas ranches, this generosity looked like something else entirely, proof that everything they'd been taught about America was a lie. The United States didn't need to humiliate its enemies to prove its power. It had something the Reich never understood: moral confidence. Each day brought new revelations. When Lieselot asked one cowboy why he treated prisoners so kindly, he shrugged and said, "Lady, war's over for you when you get here. Ain't no use fighting ghosts." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more pragmatic, an American kind of mercy that measured worth by work, not by flag. The women learned to rope cattle, mend fences, and milk cows. They ate 3,200 calories a day, more than many American civilians. They attended movies in town, shopped at the general store, and slowly began to see America not as the land of degenerates they'd been promised, but as a place where ordinary decency was so common it was taken for granted. When mail was finally allowed, Lieselot sat in the bunkhouse one evening, staring at a blank piece of paper by lamplight. How could she possibly explain what was happening to her? How could she make anyone understand? Finally, she began to write. "Dearest Mama, I am alive, and I must tell you something you will not believe. I am working on a ranch in Texas. The people here are kind, truly, genuinely kind. They give us so much food I can barely eat it all. They trust us with horses, with cattle, with tools that could be weapons. We could escape any time we wanted, but we don't. Because we are free in all the ways that matter. Mama, I never thought freedom could look like this." Weeks later, the reply came, heavily censored and trembling with disbelief. "Lisa, are you sure you are well? You must be mistaken about these things. They would never treat prisoners so well. The Americans are not capable of such kindness." Even her own mother couldn't believe the truth. The lie had been told so often, so convincingly, that it had become more real than reality itself. But the truth was undeniable. Every day, the German prisoners rode deeper into a version of America that defied everything they'd been taught. They saw it in the abundance, eggs by the dozen, meat by the pound, sugar by the sack. They saw it in the machinery, tractors roaring across fields powered by seemingly endless gasoline. They saw it in the attitude, no hierarchy, no bowing, no fear. When a new group of male prisoners arrived from another camp, they watched in stunned disbelief as the women led horses from the barn, laughing and chatting freely with their American captors. "This cannot be real," one muttered in German. But it was. The sight of their female comrades riding across open pastures without chains shattered years of Nazi conditioning. It was the first proof that captivity under the Americans could be something other than humiliation. The transformation reached its peak during a violent thunderstorm in late August that nobody saw coming. Lili was mending fence when she noticed the western horizon had turned an ominous black-green. The air felt electric, charged with something dangerous. Within minutes, the sky exploded. Lightning split the heavens like God's own artillery. Thunder crashed so loud it shook the ground. The wind howled like a living thing, bending the mesquite trees nearly horizontal. And then the rain came, not gentle drops, but sheets of water that turned the world into a gray, roaring chaos. The cattle panicked. 300 head of prime Texas beef scattered across the prairie in blind terror, disappearing into the storm like ghosts. Frank appeared at the barn, soaked to the skin, shouting over the wind, "We've got to get them back before they run themselves to death." This was the moment of truth. The test that would prove whether these German women were truly part of the team or just prisoners playing dress-up. Without a word, without hesitation, every single German woman ran for the horses. They mounted up in the driving rain, their clothes instantly soaked, their hair plastered to their heads. Lightning illuminated the prairie in stark black and white, revealing scattered cattle running in every direction. "Follow me," Frank shouted, spurring his horse into the storm. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense, dangerous, exhilarating work any of them had ever done. They rode through lightning and hail, shouting commands in German and English, using every skill they'd learned to chase down terrified animals and drive them back toward safety. Lili found herself riding alongside a cowboy named Jake, the two of them working in perfect harmony to corner a group of steers trying to bolt toward a dangerous ravine. When Jake's horse stumbled, she was there to help him up. When her lasso got tangled, he was there to free it. Language didn't matter. Nationality didn't matter. There were no Germans and Americans in that storm, only people working together to save something precious. Hours later, as the storm finally passed and the last rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, they rode back to the ranch together, exhausted, triumphant, and completely transformed. Every single animal had been saved. Frank walked among them as they dismounted, his weathered face streaked with rain and mud and something that looked suspiciously like tears. "I've been ranching for 30 years, he said quietly, "and I ain't never seen anything finer than what y'all did out there today. Guess y'all ain't just city girls after all." That night, while the women slept the deep sleep of the truly exhausted, the ranch hands worked by lamplight, painting a sign. In the morning, it hung over the bunkhouse door, the German Cowgirls, hell or high water. Lili looked at it in disbelief, then laughed until tears came. Somewhere deep inside, a fundamental shift had occurred. The war, the propaganda, the fear, it all seemed like something from another lifetime. What mattered now was survival, work, and the strange dignity of being trusted. In a world at war, that trust was rarer than gold. But the story was far from over. April 1945. The wind across the plains carried the scent of spring grass and rain when Frank appeared at the barn door, his face solemn, holding a folded newspaper. "Ladies," he said quietly, "it's over." For a moment, no one spoke. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap that hadn't yet broken. "What do you mean?" Lili whispered. The war. Germany surrendered. Some women froze. Others dropped their tools. Anna covered her mouth and began to cry softly. Lieselot just stared at the ground, her mind blank. 4 years, everything, every breath, every fear, every hope, had been tied to the war. Now, suddenly it was gone. No one cheered. There was no celebration, only stunned silence and the distant lowing of cattle. That evening, they gathered around the fire one last time, faces lit by flickering orange light, unsure whether to feel relief or grief. Frank poured coffee for everyone and said quietly, "It's done now. You'll all be going home soon." The word hit harder than any news of surrender. What did home even mean anymore? Their towns might be gone, their families dead, their country nothing but rubble. In the days that followed, U.S. Army trucks arrived to transport them back to official camps where they would await ships bound for Europe. The cowboys stood quietly by as the women packed their few belongings. Frank approached Lieselot as she folded her work gloves into a small canvas bag. "Reckon you'll be going home soon," he said softly. She nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. For everything." He smiled, eyes squinting under the brim of his hat. "Ain't nothing to thank me for. You all worked hard. Earned your keep." Then, with a playful grin, he reached behind him and held out something wrapped in brown paper. "Got something for you." Inside was a brand new Stetson hat, cream-colored and soft as suede. "So you don't forget Texas," he said. Lieselot laughed through tears as she put it on, the brim shading her eyes. The ranch hands hooped and clapped, and someone shouted, "Yeehaw! The German cowgirl rides again." When the trucks finally rolled out, the women looked back through the wooden slats and watched the ranch fade into the distance, the barns, the windmill, the men waving their hats in farewell. For Lieselot, that sight would never fade. It wasn't just a place. It was a revelation. She had come to Texas a prisoner and was leaving as something else entirely, someone who had glimpsed a different way of living, where dignity came not from rank or fear, but from simple respect. As the truck rumbled down the dusty road, she whispered to herself, "Maybe we lost the war. But perhaps we can still win the peace." The journey home took months. When the ship carrying Lieselot finally reached Bremerhaven, Germany, it was winter again, cold, gray, and broken. The docks were ruins. The city was flattened. What had once been streets were now rivers of rubble. American officers handed them small care packages before they disembarked, chocolate bars, canned food, and letters with instructions on where to go next. The sight of an American Red Cross logo on every box was both surreal and humbling. For years, they had been taught that Americans were monsters, materialistic, cruel, and without honor. But now, holding a Hershey bar and wearing a Texas cowboy hat, Lieselot felt the weight of that lie crumble completely. When she arrived in her hometown, what she found confirmed what she already knew in her heart. The war had devoured everything. Her house was gone, her parents dead, her village burned. But in the ashes of destruction, she carried something the ruins could not erase, an idea she had learned under the Texas sun. She began working as a translator for the Allied occupation forces. Her English, learned from cowboys and ranch hands, was rough and full of slang, but it got her noticed. American officers often smiled when she called them partner or said ain't. She told them stories of Texas ranches, wide skies, and the kindness of men who had treated prisoners not as enemies, but as human beings. In 1948, Lieselot was invited to speak at a post-war women's conference in Stuttgart. The topic, Rebuilding Through Understanding. She stood before an audience of German and Allied women, former enemies now seated side by side, and told them about her time in Texas. "I was a prisoner of war," she began softly, "but I never felt like one." She spoke of cowboys who shared their food, of Frank Callahan's quiet dignity, of the day she first wore a Stetson and felt, perhaps for the first time, truly equal. "I learned that freedom," she said, "is not given by nations. It is given by people, one act of kindness at a time." Her words moved the crowd to tears. When she finished, an American woman came forward and embraced her. It was the first time many in that hall had seen such a thing. A German and an American, once enemies, now sisters. The ending of this story will give you chills. Years later, in 1952, Lisa Lott would immigrate to the United States, not as a refugee fleeing destruction, but as a woman consciously choosing her home. She settled in San Antonio, Texas, just 200 miles from where she had once worked as a prisoner of war. She opened a small bakery that she called the German Cowgirl, and it became legendary throughout South Texas for its incredible fusion of German pastries and Southern flavors: apple strudel with pecan crumble, sauerkraut kolaches, pretzels dusted with smoked barbecue salt. But the real attraction wasn't the food. It was the story. Above the counter hung a framed photograph that stopped customers in their tracks. A young woman in 1945 wearing a cowboy hat too big for her head, standing beside a tall, weathered rancher with the shy smile of a man who had never expected to be photographed. Both were covered in dust and grinning like fools. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "From enemies to friends, Texas, 1945. When people asked her about it, and they always did, drawn by something in that photograph that seemed to glow with its own inner light, she would set down whatever she was doing, wipe her floury hands on her apron, pour them a cup of coffee that was always somehow perfect, and tell them the most incredible story they'd ever heard. She never told it the same way twice, but the heart of it never changed. The fear, the transformation, the moment when everything she thought she knew about the world fell away like old paint. She would talk about Frank's calloused hands teaching her to hold a rope, about the sound of cattle lowing at sunset, about the night she sang Lili Marleen around a campfire with men who had been shooting at her people just months before. And always she would end the same way. "You see, they didn't just feed our bodies. They fed our souls. They showed us that it was possible to be strong without being cruel, to be victorious without being vengeful. That's the real America, not the one in movies or politics, but the one that lives in the hearts of good people everywhere." "That's Frank Callahan," she would say, her eyes growing distant and bright, as if she could still see him standing there in his dusty boots and too wide smile. "That's the man who taught me what America really is. Not the politicians with their speeches, or the generals with their medals, or the movie stars with their perfect faces. Just a cowboy who looked at a bunch of scared German girls and decided that kindness was stronger than hate, that trust was more powerful than fear." She would pause then, touching the glass over the photograph with fingers that still remembered the feel of rope and leather. He probably never knew he was changing history. He was just doing what seemed right, treating people the way he'd want to be treated if he was far from home and scared and alone. But that's the thing about real heroism. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It just quietly makes the world a better place, one small act at a time. Many customers would leave in tears. Some would come back again and again, bringing friends and family to hear the story. Veterans from later wars, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, would sit quietly and nod, recognizing something in her words that they'd been searching for themselves. The bakery became an unofficial pilgrimage site for anyone struggling to understand how enemies could become friends, how hatred could transform into love, how the worst of times could somehow bring out the best in people. By the time Lisa Lott passed away in 1987, she had become a symbol of reconciliation in her community. Former POWs, both men and women, would visit her bakery, trading memories of war and the strange kindness they had found in the most unlikely of places. Her bakery became a gathering place for cowboys and immigrants, veterans and refugees, people from every corner of the world who had discovered what she had learned so many years ago, that America, at its best, is not a place or a politics, but an idea. The radical idea that every person, no matter where they come from or what they've done, deserves a chance at dignity. The German cowgirl closed when Lieselot died, but the building still stands. There's a historical marker there now, telling the story of the woman who came to Texas as a prisoner and left as an American. But even that doesn't capture the full truth of what happened in that place. Historians now say that these prisoner experiences played a quiet but vital role in shaping post-war relations between Germany and the United States. Thousands of former prisoners returned home with stories of fairness, decency, and compassion. They became the first human bridges in a world desperate to rebuild trust. These former prisoners went on to become teachers, business leaders, politicians, and journalists. They raised children who grew up hearing stories not of American brutality, but of American kindness. They built businesses that traded with American companies. They supported policies that aligned West Germany with the Western Alliance. In countless small ways, they helped transform Germany from a devastated enemy into America's most reliable European ally. They proved that people-to-people diplomacy, the simple act of treating others with dignity, could be more powerful than any treaty or trade agreement. The ripple effects continue to this day. The strong friendship between Germany and America, the success of NATO, the peaceful reunification of Germany, all of these historic achievements had roots in the dusty soil of Texas ranches where former enemies learned to work side by side. It's a reminder that the biggest moments in history often begin with the smallest acts of human decency. That sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with bullets and bombs, but with kindness and coffee, with patient teaching and quiet trust. In the end, it wasn't treaties or governments that began the healing. It was the simple decency of ordinary people. And on a Texas ranch in 1945, a cowboy with a gentle heart had done more to mend the wounds of war than any diplomat ever could. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't won on the battlefield. It's earned in the quiet grace of forgiveness. That's the story of how America won a war not through force, but through something far more powerful, the revolutionary idea that even enemies deserve dignity. In a world torn apart by hatred, a few cowboys in Texas proved that kindness could be the ultimate weapon. They proved that strength doesn't have to mean domination, that victory doesn't require humiliation, that the most effective way to defeat an enemy might just be to show them a better way to live. It's a lesson that echoes through American history, from the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe to the GI Bill that educated a generation, from the Peace Corps to countless acts of individual generosity that never make headlines. The idea that lifting others up lifts everyone. That dignity shared is dignity multiplied. Frank Callahan probably never thought he was changing the world. He was just trying to get his cattle to market and his fences mended. But in treating enemy prisoners like human beings deserving of respect, he did something more powerful than any general or politician. He planted seeds of reconciliation that would grow into the friendship between two great nations. Today, Germany and the United States are among the closest allies in the world. That partnership didn't begin in boardrooms or at summit meetings. It began on dusty ranches in Texas, where former enemies learned to trust each other one day at a time, one act of kindness at a time. And that, perhaps, is the most American story ever told. The story of a nation so confident in its ideals that it could afford to be generous even to those who had tried to destroy it. Because in the end, the greatest victory isn't just defeating your enemies. It's turning them into friends.